The first sign that something was wrong wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, it was just quiet. Too quiet for a Saturday morning. I was pouring my second cup of coffee when my wife glanced at the clock and said, "They should have been home by now, right?" That was it, just a simple observation, but in my gut it was like the floor shifted. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from down in the comments, and tap that like and subscribe if stories like this have ever brushed past your own life. Every click helps pull another forgotten name back into the light. My name's Mark Benner. I was 38 years old back then, working night shifts at a distribution warehouse outside Yuba City, California. Small-town life suited me fine. My wife taught at the elementary school, and most weekends we kept to a pretty easy rhythm. Errands, a drive, maybe dinner with friends. Things stayed quiet. Predictable. That's how we liked it. I'd known those 5 boys well men since they were teenagers. They weren't exactly kids, but they weren't fully out in the world either. Each one had their own challenges, but together they worked like a unit. Loyal to a fault, gentle-hearted. They loved basketball more than anything. Most weekends you'd see them packed into Travis's big turquoise Mercury, laughing over fast food or on their way to a game. Ricky Palmer was the thoughtful one. He'd had a tough run with schizophrenia in his early 20s, but medication was helping and he was doing better than he had in years. Joel Wallace was like a golden retriever in human form. Big smile, loved being outside, loved his friends even more. Danny Ray had a childlike spirit and a deep love for his church. He'd bring cookies to the library ladies every Christmas just because. Travis. He was the quiet backbone of the group, steady, protective. That car of his was spotless always. And then there was Tommy Dunn, outgoing, always asking how your day was. He wore his Special Olympics hoodie with more pride than most folks wear a uniform. They were good boys. Just good boys who trusted each other and trusted the world. Friday, February 24th, 1978. They had tickets to a college basketball game up in Chico, about an hour drive north. It was the night before their own Special Olympics tournament, and they were excited. Travis picked everyone up like he always did. Joel had laid out his jersey the night before. Danny had told his mom he was gonna win a medal. It was all set. That night, I remember it got cold, below freezing. One of those nights where the fog rolls in thick around the street lamps and your breath stays hanging in the air longer than it should. But still, we all figured they'd be home by midnight. They never were the type to stay out late, especially not before something important. By sunrise, something just felt off. I called around. No one had heard from them. Danny's dad drove by the rec center, just in case. Travis's mom called the neighbors. One by one, we all started making the same calls. Then someone said it out loud. What if they never made it back? And just like that, the quiet turned heavy. Like the whole town had started holding its breath. We didn't know it yet, but that would be the last normal morning any of us ever had. We didn't have to wait long before word got out. By midday, it seemed like everyone in town knew the boys hadn't made it home. I drove over to Travis's place first. His car was gone, and his mother was already on the porch, arms folded tight like she was bracing for something she couldn't name. I asked if she'd heard anything. She shook her head without looking up, eyes fixed on the street like the car might reappear if she stared hard enough. Across town, Danny's parents were doing the same, checking the driveway, calling the local rec center just in case someone had seen the group. They tried not to let their voices shake, but even over the phone you could hear it. Something wasn't right. We all knew it even before the police got involved. The call went out that afternoon. Official missing persons reports. 5 men grown, yes, but all known to need structure predictability. None of them would have skipped their tournament. Not after the way they'd talked it up for weeks. Not after the uniforms were ironed, the snacks packed, the families lined up to cheer. The car was spotted 2 days later. A forest ranger called it in abandoned on a rutted-out stretch of mountain road up near the Plumas National Forest, maybe 70 miles northeast of Chico. It was so far off course it didn't even make sense. None of us even knew that road existed. It wasn't on the way home. It wasn't on the way to anything. I drove up the next morning with one of the sheriff's deputies. The road turned to gravel fast, then to packed dirt and snow winding up through forest thick with pine and silence. And then there it was. Travis's Mercury Montego pulled slightly off the road, not stuck, just sitting there like someone had meant to come back. The driver's door was unlocked, one window down about halfway. No keys inside, but the engine turned over when they tested it. Quarter tank of gas still left. No flat tires. Nothing missing. Just quiet. The kind that presses in on your chest. The snacks they bought after the basketball game were still there. Half-eaten pie wrappers, candy bars, empty chocolate milk cartons. No signs of a struggle. No blood. No prints, but theirs. The sheriff stepped back and looked down the slope like maybe the answers were hiding in the tree line. All I could think about was how cold it had gotten that night, 20 degrees, maybe lower. And those boys hated the cold. Travis, especially. He wouldn't have taken that road on a bet. Somebody spotted faint footprints in the snow not far from the car 5 sets looked like. Headed downhill, then veered off into the woods before disappearing under fresh snowfall. Search and rescue came in fast. Dogs, helicopters, volunteers with laminated maps and snow gear. They scanned that mountain like it owed them answers. But the farther they pushed into the woods, the less sense it all made. The tracks ended. No sign of shelter, no bodies. Just miles of trees and silence that swallowed your voice when you called out. For days, we walked that terrain. I remember trudging through snow up to my knees, calling out their names, listening for anything. Branches breaking voices, even birds. But there was nothing. The forest had swallowed them whole. The families kept coming. People brought food. Flyers went up in every store window in Yuba City. 5 pictures in a row. 5 sets of eyes looking straight at you. I saw someone tack one up at the post office and just stare at it afterward like maybe they'd missed something the first time. Tips came in, of course. A man said he'd seen a group fitting the boy's description walking down the same road the car was found on sometime that night. But he got fuzzy on the details. Could have been someone else. Could have been nothing. Then came a phone call anonymous, a man's voice telling the police to search a specific area up near a fire access road. They went. Found nothing. Another dead end. People started whispering. At the diner at the barber shop. You'd hear everything from cults to drugs to Gary having a breakdown and leading the rest off into the woods. But I knew Ricky. He was doing better than he had in years. He'd worked hard to get his mind right again. Besides, even if something had happened, why leave the car? Why not wait for daylight? Why walk into the freezing dark with no plan? Every theory hit a wall. The car wasn't broken. They had food. They weren't in trouble, at least not in the usual sense, and still nothing. No clothing found. No footprints past that first short trail. No phone calls. No credit card use. No witnesses. It was like they'd stepped off the road and dissolved. I remember one night a few weeks in, I sat on the front steps of my house and listened to the wind roll down from the foothills. It was the kind of cold that made your teeth hurt. I thought about Joel, about his sneakers, he always tied them too loose, and wondered if he'd even made it past that first mile. I thought about Danny, the way he used to hum church songs under his breath, about Ricky's laugh, Tommy's baseball cap, Travis's careful way of checking that car door twice before he locked it. I couldn't square it. None of us could. Weeks passed. The search scaled back. Winter dragged on. The flyers started curling at the edges, but we kept waiting, kept walking to the phone every time it rang, hoping. Then one afternoon in early spring, I stopped by the sheriff's office to drop off a new photo someone had found of the group at the rec center. And as I was leaving, I overheard one of the deputies mention something odd. A man who worked up at a nearby lodge had reported hearing shouting the night the boys disappeared. Whistling, too. Around 2:00 a.m., echoing through the trees. He looked but didn't see anyone. Said the voices just faded out. Nobody mentioned it officially. They didn't write it up as part of the active investigation, but it stayed with me. Like a ripple in the surface that didn't match the rest of the water. I went home that night and circled the date on the calendar. February 24th. The last day any of them were seen. The last night those 5 friends left together in that car, and the first night the mountain started holding its silence. At first we tried to tell ourselves it was just confusion. A wrong turn, maybe. Maybe they'd gotten stuck and someone had picked them up. Maybe they were waiting out the weather somewhere. But as the days dragged on and the mountains stayed silent, that kind of hope started to sound foolish even in our own mouths. Still, I kept showing up at the sheriff's office checking for updates. They let me sit in on a few briefings, mostly because I wasn't just a friend, I'd worked alongside some of those boys for years. I knew how they thought, how they planned things, and none of this fit. The investigators walked us through it again and again. 5 men drive an hour north to watch a basketball game, leave in good spirits, stop for snacks after 10, then end up 70 miles in the opposite direction, halfway up a dirt road in the middle of a national forest. No one could explain that part, especially not Travis's family. He knew that car like the back of his hand. He didn't even like gravel roads, let alone mountain terrain with snow on the ground. He was proud of that car, kept the tires rotated, the interior spotless, always filled it the night before a trip. He wouldn't have driven it up there unless something or someone gave him no choice. But when we tried to voice that, when we said something didn't feel right, folks just nodded politely and circled back to the same explanations. Maybe they got lost. Maybe the cold made them panic. Maybe one of them had a breakdown and the rest followed. At a certain point, it stopped feeling like anyone was really listening. One of the deputies pulled me aside and said, "I know you want to believe it's something more, but sometimes people just make bad decisions." I remember staring at him thinking this wasn't just a bad decision. This was 5 men, cautious, routine-loving men, abandoning a warm car with gas in the tank and walking into a snow-covered forest in street clothes. That wasn't panic. That was something else. The families tried to raise their concerns too. Danny's mother brought in old notes from his school counselor showing how much he struggled with change. She told them her son didn't even like going to the next town over unless he knew exactly where they were going. Joel's sister Sarah printed out a map to scale and tried to explain the distance from the highway to that mountain road. "It's not a place you'd accidentally end up," she kept saying. But the search had slowed by then. They'd already sent teams up with dogs and snowmobiles, found no tracks past the first 100 yards. The weather had turned everything to ice and then to mud. There's no way to know what happened up there, the sheriff told us. We might never know. Still, I kept coming. I kept asking questions. So did Sarah. So did Travis's uncle, who'd once been a local reserve deputy. We called the Forest Service to ask about nearby cabins or shelters in case the boys had tried to take cover. We checked the visitor logs from a couple of the seasonal lodges that sat shuttered for winter. Nothing. We weren't asking for miracles, we just wanted someone to stay curious. But the longer the case sat cold, the more people started to shift. I noticed it in the way folks spoke to us. At first, everyone offered help, sympathy casseroles. Then came the theories. Quiet at first, then sharper. "You know, Ricky had problems." One neighbor whispered to me while I was standing in line at the post office. He might have snapped. Could have led them off somewhere they couldn't get back from. Another man, someone I used to bowl with, said flat out, "I always thought there was something strange about that one." It wasn't even subtle anymore. I wanted to shout at them, remind them how Ricky had been doing, how he'd made progress, how he'd been talking about the tournament non-stop for weeks. But there's a kind of weight that settles in when you realize people don't want the truth. They want closure, even if it's the wrong kind. They wanted a story that made sense, something tidy to file away. But nothing about this was tidy. Not the car, not the trail, not the missing footprints, not the untouched snacks left right there in the back seat like they were coming back any minute. Then came the anonymous call. The dispatcher didn't give us much detail, just said a man's voice phoned in late at night and gave what sounded like coordinates. Said they'd find the boys there. That was all. No name, no follow-up. The police checked the area, another dead end. But that call stuck with us. Something about the timing, something about the certainty in the man's voice. When we asked to hear the recording, we were told it had been misplaced. Just like that. I don't know if it was incompetence or something worse, but after that, Sarah stopped calling the sheriff. She started spending more time online looking through message boards, cross-referencing cold cases in nearby counties. The rumors shifted again. People started talking about cults, about drugs, about something they might have seen that night they weren't supposed to. That area's full of people who don't want to be found. One of the volunteers told me as we walked a ridge trail above the tree line. If those boys crossed the wrong fence line, someone could have made sure they didn't walk back out. But that was just another theory in a pile that was growing heavier by the week. By the end of March, most of the flyers were faded from the sun, some torn by wind, others taken down quietly. A few stayed up laminated and nailed to posts by the edge of town, but people had stopped looking. We hadn't. Travis's uncle kept maps in the trunk of his truck and drove new routes every weekend. I walked the back edges of the river paths by the base of the foothills just in case they'd gotten turned around. It didn't matter that the official search had ended. We hadn't. We couldn't. One night in early April, I found myself standing outside the car again. It was still impounded, sitting in a chain-link lot behind the station. I pressed my hand to the hood cold even under the afternoon sun. I tried to picture them sitting there, Joel humming something under his breath, Danny biting into a pie, Ricky watching the tree line, curious. And then I looked out at the road, at the way it wound up and away, narrowing into thick trees. It didn't feel like a place you went by mistake. It felt like a place you were led. I didn't say that out loud, not then. But something about that night stuck with me. Not just the whistling the lodge worker said he heard or the way the car door was left unlocked. It was the stillness, as if whatever had happened had passed through quickly and left no room for return. I stood there a while longer, watching the tree line darken with the setting sun, and I remember thinking, not for the first time, that whatever we were looking for out there, it wasn't lost. It was hidden. On purpose. I stopped going to church for a while that spring. It wasn't out of anger, not really. It was more that the quiet started getting too loud. People meant well, but every handshake carried a question. Every prayer offered up at the altar just circled back to the same unspoken truth: they were still gone. 5 good boys. Vanished without a trace, and all we had were theories that changed week to week depending on who you asked. I kept showing up at Travis's house in the mornings even after his mother stopped answering the door. Sometimes I'd just sit out front in my truck for an hour or two, like somehow being closer to that old house might bring something into focus. She left his bedroom exactly the way he had it, bed-made tournament jersey laid out across the chair bag packed. No one said the word memorial, but we were all moving around like we were walking through one. The hardest thing was how the world just kept going. Folks got back to their routines. Grass got mowed, groceries got picked up. Baseball came back on the radio. The rec center still held its spring programs. The Special Olympics tournament went on as scheduled, even though nobody on the team wanted to play. I remember standing in the doorway of the gym that morning watching another group of boys run warm-up drills while the bleachers filled with polite clapping and awkward smiles. No one mentioned the missing players. No one needed to. Their absence sat in every corner of that gym like a folded flag. I started losing sleep around then. Not from nightmares, just from thinking. I kept going back to that car, not just where it was found, but what it meant. Travis would never leave that car unlocked, not even in town, and the way the snacks were left behind half-finished like someone thought they'd be coming right back. It made me feel like something interrupted them, something sudden, something that didn't give them a chance to decide. But every time I brought that up to the investigators, they'd glance at each other, then fall back on what they called the likeliest scenario. Got lost, got scared, left the car to find help. I asked them more than once why 5 men would go looking for help without jackets, without flashlights, without turning around when they realized how deep they were getting. They'd just say, "People panic." Then they'd change the subject. There were times I wondered if maybe I was the one who couldn't let it go. My wife hinted at it gently one night over dinner, asked if maybe I should talk to someone or at least take a break from the search groups. I told her I would. I didn't. Most of us didn't. Travis's uncle was still driving those back roads every weekend. Sarah Wallace had started compiling everything into notebooks, weather patterns, maps, snippets from old police statements. She had dozens of pages, most of them marked with yellow tabs and handwritten questions in the margins. I'd never seen her like that before. So quiet, so focused. She wasn't trying to prove anything to the police anymore. She was trying to understand the boys themselves. Why they would have split up. Why they would have walked away from shelter. Why they hadn't come back. That question sat heavier than the rest. The car wasn't stuck. The engine worked. The doors were unlocked. Whatever pulled them from it, fear-confusion force, left no visible trace. It was mid-May when I finally stepped away from the search. Not because I'd stopped looking for answers, but because I could feel myself crossing a line I couldn't come back from. I'd started driving the same mountain road over and over, measuring distances by foot. I'd even taken to sitting in the woods some afternoons just listening, like I expected the trees to give something back. They never did. I told myself I was just being thorough. But the truth was, I was beginning to chase shadows. Sarah didn't stop. She sent letters to retired officers, posted on early message boards asking if anyone in the area had heard anything strange that February night. Most of the replies were dead ends. But one stood out. A man claiming he'd heard voices shouting and what sounded like whistling near a service trail just north of where the car was found. He worked part-time at a lodge nearby and had been out checking snow equipment when he thought he heard it. Said he followed the sound for a minute, but it faded. When Sarah asked if he'd reported it at the time, he admitted he hadn't. "Didn't want to get involved," he said. That phrase stuck with me longer than I'd like to admit. By June, I'd returned to work full-time. The warehouse didn't feel the same, but the routine helped. I kept a photo of the 5 boys on the inside of my locker. It was taken the fall before everything happened. Travis leaning against the car, Ricky and Tommy grinning at something off camera. Joel with his shoelaces untied as always, and Danny holding a basketball like it was something sacred. I'd glance at it every morning before I punched in, and every time I did, I'd wonder what piece we were missing. Something small. Something overlooked. I wasn't the only one thinking that way. The families had started gathering once a week at the community hall, not to mourn, but to share whatever they'd come across. Newspaper clippings, voice recordings, secondhand sightings. The room was never loud, but it was never silent either. Just the steady hum of people who refused to forget. Then, one afternoon, Sarah brought something up that quieted the whole room. She'd found out that there was a Forest Service trailer about 20 miles from where the car was located. Abandoned for the winter, mostly used for seasonal crews. It wasn't marked on most public maps. She'd come across a mention of it in an old hiking guide while looking through library archives. No one, as far as we knew, had ever checked it. She read the name of the trailhead where it branched off, and Travis's uncle wrote it down without saying a word. The next morning he drove up there alone. And for the first time in weeks, we all had the same thought. Maybe there was still something out there. Maybe the silence hadn't told us everything yet. The call came in just after 7 that evening. I was still at the warehouse finishing up some scheduling paperwork when the phone rang in the break room. It was Travis's uncle. He didn't raise his voice, didn't say much beyond the facts. He'd found the trailer, the Forest Service unit Sarah had told us about. He said it was open window broken out and that something was inside. He didn't describe it right away, just said, "You'll want to come up here. Bring someone from the sheriff's office, and maybe someone from the family." I hung up and drove straight to the station. An hour later, I was following a marked unit up a side trail I'd never noticed before, a single-lane path that twisted deeper into the forest than I ever thought those boys could have made it. The sun was still holding on to the edges of the trees, but shadows were taking over the road fast. The trailer sat maybe 2 miles from the closest access point, tucked behind a thinning stand of pines. It was old but solid, the kind of structure used seasonally by Forest Service crews in the summer, metal siding, narrow windows, basic bunk setups inside. One of the deputies was already there, standing just off to the side with his hands in his pockets. He gave a quick nod, but no one spoke at first. The air felt still in a way I hadn't felt since the week the boys vanished, like the woods themselves were holding something back. Inside, the air was dry and stale. Cold. There were supplies everywhere, canned goods stacked neatly on open shelves, a Coleman stove with propane tanks folded, blankets, heavy coats hanging on wall hooks. Nothing looked disturbed. Nothing had been used. And there, in the far bunk, under a tangle of blankets pulled up almost to the chin, lay what we'd come for. It was Ted. Tommy Dunn. I'd known even before the deputy said his name. The build, the shape of his jaw, the curve of one hand left exposed under the sheet. The room had no smell of death, no rot, just a faint sharpness like something dry and old and finished. He wasn't wearing shoes. His feet were wrapped in what looked like layers of fabric shirt sleeves, maybe torn pieces of something else. The frostbite had done its work long ago. His beard was long, his cheeks hollow, and despite everything around him, the coats, the food, the stove, it looked like he'd just laid down and waited. The coroner would later estimate he'd survived for weeks, maybe as long as 2 months. The blankets had been tucked around him carefully, like someone had taken time or had tried to give comfort. But there were no signs anyone else had stayed with him. No second bed disturbed. No extra plates. Just his shoes neatly placed by the door and a rough journal entry found near the shelf scrawled on the back of a flyer. The writing was shaky, fragmented, not a full account, just the date over and over again. March 3rd, March 9th, March 14th. Then nothing. When I stepped outside, I had to sit down on the concrete steps for a minute, not because I was overwhelmed, but because something about the scene didn't make sense. Ted had made it 20 miles through deep snow and bitter cold. He'd found shelter. He'd been surrounded by everything he needed to survive. And still he'd starved. He hadn't lit the stove, hadn't opened the food, hadn't even used the extra layers packed into the bins near the rear wall. It was like survival had never even started. A new search perimeter was drawn the next day. Based on the location of the trailer, they widened the sweep in a slow arc outward, hoping to find some sign of the others. I joined the teams working the southern ridge line, steep country brush choked in places, but open enough to cover with a methodical grid. We found Joel Wallace first. Not whole, but enough. A femur later matched by dental records to jaw fragments found nearby. His clothes were scattered, weather-worn. His sneakers, half buried under a rotted log, looked like they'd been taken off and dropped. Maybe by him. Maybe not. About 100 yards past that, we found part of Danny Ray's jacket. Another searcher came upon what was left of Travis Hill later that same afternoon. Skeletal remains lodged in a dry creek bed picked apart by time and animals. No signs of violence. Just exposure. Just loss. The ground up there had given them back slowly without ceremony. No obvious paths between them. No single direction or pattern. It was as if after leaving the car they'd tried to stay together. And then something pulled them apart. Maybe panic, maybe exhaustion, maybe some decision made in desperation. But only Ted had made it as far as the trailer, and he hadn't made it out. Gary was still missing. Ricky Palmer, the one everyone had whispered about from the beginning, the one people blamed sometimes openly. But here's what stayed with me. His shoes were found inside the trailer, neatly set off to the side like someone had taken them off with care. Like maybe he'd been there alive with Ted. Maybe he'd wrapped the blankets. Maybe he'd set the shoes down and gone out to find help. Maybe he never came back. There were no signs of struggle. No blood, just silence, the kind that stretches out long and slow and final. By the time the last of the remains were brought down from the ridge, summer had settled in. The case wasn't closed technically, it still isn't, but there was a shift. In the papers, in the town, in the way people spoke at the grocery store. It became past tense. The boys became those poor boys. The woods became that place. And Gary's name turned into a question. One no one wanted to say out loud. But the facts sat where they always had. The car worked. The engine started. The trailer was stocked. The stove functioned. 5 friends vanished in February. 4 were found months later, broken by the cold, separated by miles of snow-covered silence. The 5th, the one with the history everyone kept pointing to, was still out there. Somewhere. Or gone for good. I didn't know which haunted me more, but I knew the story wasn't done. Not yet. Something was still off. Something we hadn't seen. Something none of us had the words for, but we all felt it every time the wind came down off that mountain, just a little too quiet. I went back up there once more before the snow came down again. Early October. The leaves had started to turn, and the sun felt lower somehow, even at midday. I didn't tell anyone I was going, just packed a thermos and some trail markers and headed out. There was something I needed to feel for myself, and I knew I wasn't going to get it from a report or a photograph. I parked near the same pull-off where the car had been found that first week in February. The area was quiet again, like time had folded itself back into the earth. The trail to the Forest Service trailer had mostly faded under brush and pinefall, but I knew the way. I followed it slow, listening more than moving. Every few yards I'd stop, take in the space, try to picture it the way it might have looked that night, covered in snow, moonlight stretching through bare branches, 5 sets of footprints heading into the unknown. But there were still too many things I couldn't place. Too many turns that didn't line up. I kept wondering how Ted made it all the way to that trailer on foot. Alone. Cold. Injured. How he'd known it was there. Unless he didn't. Unless someone had already known the way. That question had been living in my mind since the day we found him. You don't walk 20 miles through snow in street shoes by accident. Not without water. Not without a flashlight. Not unless someone's guiding you. But if Gary had made it with him and all signs pointed that he had, then the other question was harder to sit with. Why didn't he stay? I took my time approaching the trailer. It was boarded up now, half concealed by branches, a red ribbon tied around the railing to mark it for seasonal inventory. I didn't go inside. I didn't need to. I just sat on a rock about 30 feet away and looked at it through the trees. That's when I noticed something I hadn't remembered from before. About 40 yards off the south side, down a short dip in the terrain, was a small clearing. Not perfectly circular, more of a flattened patch in the brush. Nothing carved or fenced, just beaten down enough to catch the eye if you were looking for it. I stood there for a long time, watching the way the wind moved through the tops of the trees, but never seemed to touch that spot. I didn't go closer. I still don't know why. That same week, Sarah got a letter in the mail. No return address, postmark out of Eureka. Inside was a photocopy, an old regional map showing the same part of the national forest we'd all become too familiar with. But this copy had markings, faint lines drawn in pencil mapping a route from the main road through 2 old logging cuts up past the service trail. The path curved right through the spot where the trailer sat, but the odd part was a second mark off to the east, a red dot labeled simply, "Look again." Sarah brought it straight to the sheriff's office, but no one knew what to make of it. The paper had no fingerprints, nothing on the envelope either, just that phrase, "Look again." We did. Over the next few weekends, a handful of us returned to the area. Some were official search and rescue, others just friends and family who couldn't let it rest. I walked that eastern slope, the side facing away from where the car had been found. It was steeper than I remembered. Denser, too. There were signs someone had moved through there before. Old boot prints barely visible. A torn piece of canvas caught on a branch. Nothing you could date. Nothing that gave us more than speculation. But it wasn't nothing either. Around that time, someone else came forward. A man who'd worked seasonal maintenance at a private lodge about 10 miles from the area. He said he remembered hearing about the disappearance back in '78. Remembered because the morning after the basketball game, he and another worker had gone out early to check the power line cut behind the property's standard winter prep. He said they found something then. A scrap of fabric, a white athletic sock half buried in snow caught on a metal post. He'd always thought it odd, but never said anything at the time. Said he assumed it belonged to a hunter or a stray hiker. When Sarah asked why he hadn't come forward earlier, he just shrugged. Didn't know it mattered, he said. It all felt like that pieces too small to stand on their own, but too specific to ignore. Bits of a map, half a story. Not enough to point anywhere solid. Still, the families tried to pull the threads. Travis's uncle drove him out to Eureka to check local libraries and record offices, see if the map had ever appeared in a guidebook or government document. He didn't find anything. Sarah had a friend look into known properties near the red dot on the map. Most were seasonal leases, some abandoned entirely. She flagged one, an old ranger outpost decommissioned in the late '60s, but it had been demolished years ago. Still, she held on to the map. Said she felt like it wasn't just a prank. Said it felt unfinished. What bothered me most was that Gary had never used his bank account. Never touched the cash his family said he'd been saving. No ID hits, no license renewal, no Social Security activity. Nothing. You'd think that kind of vanishing would leave some trace, especially for someone with a known medical history. But all we had was silence. That and the shoes. His shoes. Sitting by the trailer door as if placed there with intention. One night I sat with Sarah on her porch sipping coffee out of chipped mugs while the cicadas wound down. We didn't talk much about the case anymore, not directly. But she asked me a question I still think about. Do you think he's still out there? I didn't answer right away. I didn't know how. Because what I wanted to say was yes, but not in the way she meant. Not alive, not on foot, not hiding. But out there in the way some questions never get buried deep enough. Out there in every unanswered call, every folded map, every trail that seems to end just before it should lead somewhere. It's strange what becomes evidence over time, what sticks in the mind long after the facts grow cold. For me, it's not the trailer or the snow or even the photographs. It's the little things. The sock on the fence, the map with the red dot, the old boots that didn't belong, and that spot in the trees that didn't quite move with the wind. I still see it sometimes when I close my eyes. I still feel like something's watching from just beyond the frame. And I still believe not because it comforts me, but because it's the only thing that makes sense that someone else was out there that night. Someone who knew the roads better than those boys ever could. Someone who watched them walk away from warmth and let them. The hardest thing about not knowing is that you start filling the silence yourself. And by that 7th month, we'd all filled it with something possibility theory dread. but none of it brought us closer to what happened. The sheriff's department said they'd exhausted their leads. The official explanation hadn't changed. The group got lost, panicked, split up, and succumbed to the cold. Gary was labeled missing presumed dead. There were no plans to reopen the investigation. No more ground searches. No forensic follow-ups. The file stayed open, but it sat untouched on a shelf. The story, as far as they were concerned, was over. But none of us believed that. Not because we were chasing ghosts, but because the facts didn't line up. Not even close. Ted's body had been found in that trailer with every possible means of survival untouched. Canned food, heating, fuel, clothing, matches, all just sitting there. Gary's shoes were found beside the bed, but no one ever found his footprints leading in or out. There were no signs of struggle, no signs of anyone forcing the group off their path or into danger. But there were no clear signs they'd chosen this path either. And that was the part that stayed with us, how everything in this case was possible, but none of it felt right. Sarah kept going. She was quieter now, more deliberate. She spent most of her time reviewing documents, photos, making timelines on long sheets of butcher paper taped to her walls. Sometimes I'd come over and sit with her. We didn't talk much, just traced routes with our fingers paused over dates that didn't sit right. One night she pulled out a notebook she hadn't shown me before. In it were interviews, informal ones, handwritten from people who'd reached out to her privately. Not police statements, just accounts. And one of them stuck with me. A man named Harold Biggs lived in Brownsville, a town about halfway between Chico and the road where the car was found. He worked maintenance for the city water district. Said he'd been out late the night the boys disappeared driving back from a shift swap at the treatment plant. He remembered seeing a group of young men standing near a phone booth at the edge of town. Said it stood out to him because one of them looked confused, maybe scared. Another kept glancing over his shoulder. The time matched just past 11. The route matched too, except it was in the wrong direction. They would have had to drive well out of their way to get there from Chico. He never reported it. Said he assumed it wasn't relevant until he saw the case come up again on TV years later. He reached out to Sarah directly. She sent me to speak with him. Harold lived in a small house tucked behind a feed store. He was careful with his words, not emotional. He said he wasn't sure it was... Them couldn't say with confidence. But he did say the group had looked... uncertain. Not like tourists, not like locals either. Like they were waiting for someone but didn't want to be seen doing it, he said. I asked if anyone else was there. He said no. Just them. And then he added something strange. There was a car pulled off near the tree line. No lights on. I only noticed it because I saw exhaust in the cold air. He didn't describe the car. Could have been anything. But it raised another question. If someone had been waiting, why hadn't they come forward? Why hadn't they been found? After that, I started looking closer at the area between Chico and the mountain road. The back highways. The service routes. I found 2 more phone booths that had been in service at the time, both out of the way, both near state forest land. I checked maintenance records, but they were long gone. Still, it felt deliberate. Like someone had pulled them into a place they didn't belong. The wrong turn theory only made sense if they were driving aimlessly, but none of them were the type to wander for no reason, especially not in the dark in winter on unfamiliar roads, unless they were following someone or something. I kept thinking about that anonymous call, the one that came into the station back in March giving directions the police followed that led nowhere. It was dismissed at the time. A prank. A dead end. But what if it wasn't? What if it had come from someone who knew exactly where they were? Someone who wanted to control how the search unfolded. That's when I started thinking less about what the boys did and more about who might have been watching them. I reached out to a contact I knew in the State Patrol, retired now, but had worked that region back in the 70s. He remembered a report from around that same winter, just a few weeks before the boys disappeared. A snowplow operator had reported seeing 2 vehicles parked off a maintenance road at night. He didn't stop, but it struck him as strange. No cabins nearby, no trailheads. When he passed again 20 minutes later, both cars were gone. Nothing ever came of it. No investigation, just a line item in a winter report. But when I pulled up the area on a map, it was just 10 miles from the service trailer where Ted was found. Close enough to matter. That was when everything started to shift for me. I no longer believed this was an accident. Not fully. There were too many signs that someone else had been in the picture. Not necessarily someone who meant them harm, at least not at first, but someone who changed their direction. Someone they trusted enough to follow, or someone they were too afraid not to. I remembered something Travis's mother said that first week. That Travis didn't like driving at night, especially not on unfamiliar roads. If he'd taken that mountain path, it wasn't by choice. That car meant too much to him. He wouldn't risk it. Not for nothing. And then there was that detail no one talked much about anymore, how the car door was found unlocked. One window partway down. Snacks left uneaten, like they'd stopped briefly, like they were planning to come back. That's not how people behave when they're lost and panicking. That's how people behave when they're interrupted. I brought what I had to the sheriff's department. They listened politely, took notes, promised to keep it on file. But the tone said it all. As far as they were concerned, this case was history, a tragic mystery, nothing more. But Sarah didn't stop. She kept going. And late one night, she called me and said only this: "There's something in the police logs, something they didn't follow up on. I need you to come see it for yourself." I could hear it in her voice, that same quiet urgency I'd only heard once before the day we found the trailer. I told her I'd be there first thing in the morning, because whatever she'd found, I knew we were closer than we'd ever been to something that felt like the truth. Sarah met me out front holding the same manila folder she'd carried since the first week we'd started looking. She didn't say anything at first, just nodded for me to follow her inside. The walls of her living room were still covered in maps and notes pinned and taped in layers, most of it yellowed at the edges from months of turning. We sat down at her dining table, and she slid the folder between us like it weighed more than paper should. I was rereading the logs. She said all the ones we requested back in April. There's something buried in one of the patrol reports, something they didn't follow up on. She opened the folder and turned the pages until she landed on a scan dated March 5th, 10 days after the boys disappeared. Here, she said, pointing to a short line halfway down the page. Unconfirmed third-party call reporting possible sighting of 5 individuals on foot. Description incomplete. Report closed, deemed duplicate of earlier false lead. I read it twice, then again. The timestamp put the call around 3:40 in the morning. It had come in from a motel clerk working an overnight shift at a roadside inn just off Route 184, barely marked on any of the maps, about 18 miles southwest of the Plumas Forest boundary. The clerk's name was listed as Alan Rhodes. The report said he claimed to have seen a group of young men moving past the edge of the motel's floodlight range, walking single file, not speaking, heading north. He'd stepped out to try and call to them, but they didn't respond. He described them as wearing light jackets, looking cold, disoriented. When he tried to report it, the dispatcher told him they'd already received similar calls from that area and that the search was focused elsewhere. The incident was logged and marked resolved. Sarah leaned back in her chair and said, "I called the motel. It's gone. Closed in the early 2000s. But I found him." She opened her laptop and spun it toward me. "He still lives in Oroville. I talked to him on the phone yesterday. He remembers the night. The next day we drove out to meet him. Alan was in his 70s now, gray-haired, polite, quiet. He invited us in without asking why we were there. Said he'd figured it was only a matter of time. We sat in his sunroom while he made coffee, and when he finally sat down, his hands were already shaking. I remember the night because of how still it was," he said. "No traffic. Cold as hell. Around 3:30, I stepped out to smoke behind the office. That's when I saw them. He said they came from the trees, not from the road. 5 men. No flashlights, no talking, just walking slow and steady like they weren't really sure where they were headed. He said he recognized something was off right away. 2 of them looked like they were limping. One was holding on to another's shoulder. He yelled, but none of them turned. It was like they didn't hear me, or like they were trying not to. I asked if he'd seen a 6th person, anyone else nearby. He thought about it, then said something I'll never forget. I thought I saw someone else behind them. Not with them. Just there, watching. Could have been a tree. Could have been my eyes. But I remember thinking whoever that was, they didn't belong. We drove the route from that old motel to the general direction the group would have been heading. If they stayed north, they would have passed through a stretch of abandoned mining property closed off years ago after a landslide took out the service road. That land had never been searched. It wasn't included in the original grid because it was technically outside the active zone, but it would have been on footpath if someone was guiding them away from the main roads. That afternoon we called in what we'd learned. The sheriff's department took our report, filed it, and said they'd look into it. But we both knew what that meant. The official interest had faded. There wasn't going to be a new search crew, no forensic dive team, no air support. They'd moved on. But we hadn't. Over the next 2 weeks, a few of us made quiet trips out to that stretch of forest. We didn't go in deep, just mapped the perimeter, marked terrain that might still hold something. We found old mining markers, overgrown trails, even the remains of a small wooden structure, possibly a utility shed or weather station. We didn't find evidence, not the kind that stands up in court. But something about that place felt held, like the woods were keeping secrets on purpose. Sarah reached out to one of the regional news outlets, pitched the story again with the new details. They declined. Said the case had been covered already. Said there wasn't enough to justify another broadcast. One of the producers told her off the record that people had moved on, that no one wanted to reopen the wound. She was polite about it. Thanked him. Hung up. And then she turned to me and said, "It's still not over. There's more." She was right. Because that's when we got the photo. It showed up at my house. No return address. No note. Just a manila envelope postmarked from Nevada. Inside was a single photo. Black and white. Grainy. Looked like it had been printed from an old negative or a copy machine. It showed the clearing outside the Forest Service trailer, the one I'd sat near back in October. The trailer's shape was unmistakable. But it wasn't empty. There was someone in the foreground. Barely visible, partly obscured by shadow and motion blur. A figure standing, facing the trailer, watching it. The angle of the photo was high, like it had been taken from a tree or a raised vantage point. No identifying features, just the posture. Upright, waiting. I showed it to Sarah. She stared at it for a long time. Then she flipped it over. Written in faint blue ink on the back were 5 words. He stayed longer than you think. That was when everything stopped again. The room, the sound, even the way I was breathing. Because it meant someone had been there, not just nearby, not just passing through. Someone had watched them, had watched Ted, had possibly been with him, after everyone else was gone. We turned the photo over again and again, scanned it, sent it to the sheriff's office. They said it was unverifiable, couldn't confirm location date authenticity, said it didn't meet the threshold for reopening anything. That was the last official word we heard. But for me, it was something else entirely. It was confirmation not of guilt, not of motive, not of names, but of presence. Someone else had been there, and whoever they were, they wanted us to know just enough, and nothing more. I never did find out who sent the photo. We asked around neighbors, postal workers, even a couple of contacts Sarah still had in state records. Nothing came of it. The envelope was clean, no prints, no return address. No one claimed responsibility. It just arrived. Like everything else in this story, it showed up quietly, made everything heavier, and left us with more questions than answers. But after that day, the search stopped feeling like it was about Gary, or Ted, or any of the 5 boys we lost in that forest. It became something else. It became about understanding how something so small, one wrong turn, one moment of trust, one overlooked call could unravel so many lives. I still go up there sometimes, not often, but when I do, I don't go to the trailer. I go to the pull-off where the mercury was found. The car's long gone now, but the slope still remembers. You can see where the ground flattens out where the gravel cuts down toward the tree line. It's a quiet place. Birds move through slow. Wind doesn't hang around too long. That's where I think it began, not in a crime scene sense, but in a human one. That's where 5 friends sat together for the last time, where whatever happened next started. People always ask the same thing when they hear this story. Why didn't they turn around? Why didn't they go back to the car, use the supplies, stay together? And every time I think about how none of us know what we'd do in the dark with no signal, no clear path, and someone we think we trust telling us to follow. I don't think they were running from something. I think they were trying to reach something. Safety, maybe. Or direction. Maybe they really believed help was just around the next bend. Maybe someone promised it was. There were no arrests, no suspects, no full explanation. The sheriff's office kept the case open in name only. Said they'd log any new information, but didn't expect any. Sarah never stopped writing. She published the full timeline online the year before she moved to Oregon. Left the case file open source. Said maybe someone younger, someone new would pick it up one day and find something we missed. Travis's uncle passed the winter after that. His maps were still pinned up in the garage when his house was sold. And Gary Palmer, as of today, is still missing. No confirmed sightings, no confirmed remains. Just an absence you can feel every time you try to explain the story out loud and realize you're still avoiding the word gone. I remember the boys for what they were before all of this. Not victims, not headlines. Just friends who cared deeply for each other, who showed up on time, who cheered for the other guy even when they were losing. They were gentle souls in a world that often doesn't make space for that. They were sons, teammates, volunteers, and they deserved a better ending than the one we were left with. So if their story stayed with you, maybe sit with it a little while. Ask what you would have done, or what it means to be the last one walking, and if it helps to talk it out, I'll be here in the comments. Just leave a note. Share a name. Sometimes remembrance is the only kind of justice we get, and the only kind that lasts.